The war zone had been quiet for a long time, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that made every soldier uneasy, the kind that pressed down on the chest and made hearts pound faster. On the surface, nothing seemed to happen. Radars hummed softly. Distant explosions were rare, and the smoke of past battles had begun to settle. But the tension was like an invisible fog that wrapped around every camp, every trench and every lookout post. Soldiers who had been there for months knew that this calm was dangerous. They had seen too many sudden attacks, too many forces appear from nowhere, and they knew that war had a way of arriving when least expected. Yet despite the unease, daily life continued. Men and women checked their weapons, maintained their vehicles, and kept watch on the horizon. Even in these small routines, every action carried the weight of anticipation, because everyone knew that the war could erupt violently at any moment. News from the front lines was patchy and often contradictory. Some reports spoke of unusual movements, enemy scouts spotted in areas previously abandoned, while other reports claimed everything was normal. High command pored over intelligence intercepts, trying to make sense of the patterns in enemy communications. There were hints of an upcoming massive offensive, though the details were unclear. Soldiers tried to focus on their drills, their patrols, and their small daily tasks, but rumors spread faster than official reports. Every whispered story, every casual mention of the enemy's preparation made the waiting soldiers more anxious. They could feel the tension building in their own ranks, in the eyes of their comrades, and in the way conversations carried a sharper edge. Even civilians living near the edges of the conflict felt it. Farmers, merchants, and families who had survived previous battles watched the sky, listened for strange sounds, and wondered when the next explosion would shatter their world. Amid this anxious atmosphere, stories began circulating about a force that no one had seen but everyone had heard of. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones about the human death fleet, a mysterious armada said to be unstoppable, merciless, and precise. Some described it as a fleet that moved faster than anyone could track, striking targets with perfect timing. Others claimed the fleet could crush entire armies without warning, leaving no chance for escape. At first, these tales seemed like exaggerations, morale-boosting myths told by those desperate to find hope in a bleak situation. But as more and more stories emerged, soldiers began to wonder if there was some truth to them. Even the officers, who prided themselves on rational thinking, could not ignore the repeated reports. Maps were studied, enemy movements analyzed, and questions were raised about what such a fleet could mean for the upcoming battles. The human soldiers were not unprepared for war. They had trained for months, sometimes years, in the harshest conditions. They knew how to dig trenches, how to operate heavy artillery, and how to coordinate attacks under fire. Yet the idea of an unstoppable fleet entering the war zone was something beyond training and tactics. It represented a power that could not be countered with strategy alone. It was the unknown, and the unknown was terrifying. Every night, soldiers stared into the darkness, listening for engines, watching the skies, and imagining shapes moving silently in the distance. Every faint signal on the radar sent waves of tension through the ranks. The calm of the war zone was no longer comforting. It was a trap, a pause before chaos. Families and friends back home followed news reports with growing anxiety. Stories of the war reached them filtered through censors, military briefings, and rumors. Yet even through these limited sources, the idea of the human death fleet captured imaginations and fears alike. People wondered what it would be like to witness such a force in action. Could it be real, or was it just a legend? A story to keep hope alive or fear controlled? In barracks and bases, soldiers shared whispered conversations about what they had heard, comparing notes on intercepted messages and strange sightings. Each story was more unbelievable than the last, yet each one carried a kernel of fear and fascination. The unknown fleet became a symbol of both hope and terror, a force that could either save them or destroy everything they had fought for. Despite the tension, life went on in small, human ways. Soldiers wrote letters home, tried to rest between shifts, and shared quiet moments of camaraderie. Some joked to mask their fear. Others kept to themselves, silently thinking of what might come. The contrast between the ordinary routines and the looming threat created a strange atmosphere, a sense that the world had tilted, that everything familiar might vanish in a moment. Even simple tasks like checking weapons or patrolling the perimeter felt heavy with meaning. Each movement was watched, each noise scrutinized. The soldiers were hyper-aware of the smallest signs of change, Because in war, small signs often precede catastrophe. The calm before the storm was not only a test of patience, but also a test of nerves. Soldiers felt their confidence and courage stretched thin. Even experienced veterans who had survived countless skirmishes and battles could feel their instincts screaming that something extraordinary was approaching. Yet there was also a quiet hope mixed with fear, a hope that the human death fleet, if it existed, might turn the tide in humanity's favor. This mixture of fear, anticipation, and hope created a charged atmosphere in the war zone, a tension that made every moment feel heavier and more important. As days passed, the anxiety became almost palpable. Soldiers could feel the approaching change in the air, even though no one knew exactly when or how it would arrive. Every sound, every shift in the wind, every distant explosion seemed amplified. They trained harder, checked their equipment more carefully, and tried to prepare for something they could not fully imagine. The enemy, too, seemed uneasy, as if sensing the possibility of a powerful force about to enter the fray. The war zone existed in a delicate balance, a fragile pause that could shatter at any moment, and then, in the quiet hours before dawn, soldiers stared at the horizon, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. They could not yet see the fleet, nor could they imagine the scale of its power, but everyone felt that change was coming. The human death fleet, whether legend or reality, was about to enter the war zone. The calm would end. Lives would change. History would be written in fire and steel. The tension, the waiting, the anxious eyes on the horizon, all of it was leading to a moment that no one could predict, a moment that would make everything that had come before feel small in comparison. In that quiet before the storm, the war zone held its breath. Soldiers gripped their weapons, hearts raced, and eyes scanned the skies. The human death fleet was coming, and the world was about to witness a power unlike anything it had ever seen. The calm before the storm was more than silence, it was the suspense of the impossible, the heavy anticipation of history about to be made, and the quiet acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence of the war zone shattered in an instant, not with a warning, but with a presence so overwhelming that no one could ignore it. Soldiers on both sides had grown used to the uneasy calm, the nervous waiting that stretched on for months. They had prepared for attacks, drilled for ambushes, and trained for battles. Yet nothing could have readied them for what appeared in the sky and space above the battlefield. From the horizon, a dark shadow began to form, stretching across the heavens like a moving storm. Yet it carried no rain, only a promise of destruction. The human death fleet had arrived, and the magnitude of its presence left everyone stunned. At first, some soldiers thought it was an illusion, a trick of the light, or a hallucination brought on by long months of tension. But as the fleet grew closer, its scale became undeniable. Hundreds of massive ships emerged, each a fortress of steel and weaponry, bristling with firepower that could obliterate entire armies. The ships moved with a precision that seemed almost unnatural, gliding through the war zone like predators on a hunt. Their formation was flawless, a testament to the discipline and coordination of human forces. Every vessel seemed to know exactly where to be, exactly what to do, and exactly when to strike. The suddenness of their arrival left the enemy frozen, their carefully laid plans crumbling before they could even react. The first attacks were swift and devastating. Enemy units on the front lines were caught in the open, unprepared for the overwhelming firepower raining down upon them. Explosions tore through armored vehicles, artillery positions, and fortified bunkers, leaving nothing but smoke, fire, and twisted metal in their wake. The ground shook with each blast, and the cries of soldiers filled the air as chaos erupted. Those who survived the initial strikes tried to regroup, but the human death fleet's speed and accuracy were unmatched. It was as if the fleet anticipated every move, striking not only at soldiers but also at their communications, their supply lines, and every point that kept their army functioning. On the battlefield, confusion reigned supreme. Enemy commanders tried desperately to issue orders, but the fleet's relentless assault disrupted all communications. Radio signals were jammed or destroyed, and messengers found themselves caught in the crossfire. Panic spread through the ranks as soldiers realized that their carefully constructed defenses meant nothing. Trenches, barricades, and fortifications offered little protection against the precision strikes from above. Even the most experienced officers felt powerless, watching as the fleet tore through everything they had built over months of preparation. Civilians caught in the surrounding areas watched in horror and awe. Those who had survived previous battles knew the sounds of war, but nothing compared to the sheer intensity of the human death fleet's assault. The sky was filled with streaks of light as missiles and energy blasts moved faster than the eye could follow. Smoke rose in thick clouds from burning vehicles and shattered buildings. People who had hoped the calm would continue now understood that the war had changed entirely. It was no longer a matter of soldiers fighting soldiers. It was an unstoppable force descending from the heavens, rewriting the rules of combat with every strike. Amid the chaos, human soldiers coordinating the fleet remained calm, their discipline unshaken. Orders were precise, movements calculated, and attacks synchronized to perfection. Even under the immense stress of battle, they operated like a single organism, each individual understanding their role in a larger plan. Ground troops who had feared the enemy now looked to the fleet as a source of awe and hope. The human death fleet was more than a weapon. It was a force of strategy and purpose, and its efficiency stunned everyone who witnessed it. Each attack seemed deliberate, almost surgical, leaving devastation in its wake but targeting only what was necessary to achieve complete dominance. The enemy's response was slow and uncoordinated. Attempts to counterattack were met with immediate retaliation. Tanks were destroyed before reaching human lines, air units shot down mid-flight, and supply depots obliterated before reinforcements could arrive. The fleet's presence created a psychological pressure unlike anything soldiers had experienced. Fear spread faster than bullets or explosions, eroding confidence and forcing many to abandon positions even before being directly attacked. The realization that the human death fleet could appear anywhere, strike with deadly precision, and vanish just as suddenly left the enemy demoralized and disoriented. As the battle unfolded, stories of the fleet's sudden arrival began to circulate among soldiers. Some described witnessing entire enemy battalions vanish in minutes, swallowed by fire and chaos. Others recounted near-miraculous escapes, human units striking with uncanny accuracy to rescue their comrades from impossible situations. The battlefield became a theater of both horror and amazement, with soldiers on both sides struggling to process the scale of the assault. In the midst of destruction, tales of bravery, cunning, and almost supernatural coordination emerged, reinforcing the legend of the human death fleet. Even the terrain of the battlefield seemed to change under the fleet's influence. Hills, forests, and cities were reshaped by bombardments, turning familiar landscapes into unfamiliar, chaotic zones. Roads and bridges were obliterated, leaving paths blocked and forcing surviving soldiers to navigate a fractured environment under constant threat. Yet, despite the devastation, the human forces remained composed, moving through the battlefield with confidence and precision. Every strike was part of a larger strategy, not random chaos, and that discipline made the fleet even more terrifying to their enemies. The psychological impact of the fleet extended beyond immediate fear. Enemy soldiers began to question their leadership, their strategy, and even their purpose. Could they survive against an enemy capable of such perfection? Was resistance futile? Desertions increased, orders were ignored, and confusion spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, human soldiers witnessing the fleet's power gained renewed confidence. They saw hope, strength, and determination embodied in the ships above them, and their courage was reinforced. The fleet became a symbol, not only of destructive power but also of unwavering human resolve. As night fell, the human death fleet continued its assault, striking targets under the cover of darkness with the same precision and efficiency as during the day. Enemy forces had no safe haven, no moment to regroup, and no opportunity to plan a counterattack. The fleet's sudden appearance and relentless operations had fundamentally shifted the balance of the war. Soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike began to understand that the rules had changed. An unstoppable force had entered the war zone, and survival would require adapting to a reality dominated by this new, overwhelming presence. By the end of the day, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Smoke and fire obscured landmarks. The air was filled with the scent of burning metal and earth, and the enemy's formations lay shattered. The human death fleet had not only struck with devastating force but had also demonstrated an extraordinary mastery of strategy and coordination. It was no longer a rumor, no longer a legend whispered among anxious soldiers. It was real, tangible, and terrifying. The world had seen only a glimpse of its power, But that glimpse was enough to alter the course of the war, instill fear in the enemy, and inspire hope among humans. The arrival of the human death fleet was more than a simple battle. It was an event that redefined the war itself. The sudden, overwhelming assault demonstrated the consequences of speed, precision, and relentless strategy. Every soldier who witnessed it understood that nothing would ever be the same. The war zone had been forever changed by the appearance of this unstoppable force, and the enemy now faced a reality where survival seemed increasingly impossible. The fleet's unexpected arrival had not only crushed resistance, but had also cemented its place in history as a decisive, awe-inspiring, and terrifying power. The battlefield was a chaotic scene of fire, smoke, and destruction, but amid the chaos, the human death fleet moved with terrifying precision. Every strike was planned, every movement calculated, and every attack executed with an almost mechanical efficiency that left soldiers on both sides in awe and fear. The enemy, caught off guard by the fleet's sudden arrival, struggled to mount any meaningful defense. Their weapons, which had been effective against ordinary forces, seemed almost useless against the disciplined, coordinated, and relentless assaults of the fleet. Every explosion, every shot, and every maneuver was part of a larger strategy that only the humans seemed to understand. The fleet's attacks were unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. Massive warships hovered in formation above the battlefield, releasing barrages of missiles and energy blasts that targeted key positions with surgical accuracy. Artillery emplacements, command centers, and supply depots were obliterated within minutes. Even the most fortified positions were reduced to rubble, as if the fleet had scanned the battlefield, identified every weakness, and exploited it to the maximum. Enemy troops tried to regroup, but each movement was anticipated, intercepted, and destroyed. It was a level of precision that made the entire battlefield feel like a game of chess, with humans always 3 steps ahead. Soldiers on the ground felt the full weight of the fleet's efficiency. Tanks that had once seemed invincible were shattered by missiles before they could reach the front line. Armored personnel carriers were torn apart as they attempted to evacuate soldiers from dangerous zones. Infantry units found themselves caught in crossfires that had been perfectly timed, leaving little chance to escape. Those who survived initial attacks were often forced to flee through open terrain, only to encounter another wave of destruction moments later. Every corner of the battlefield was under the fleet's control and nowhere was safe. The enemy realized too late that the human death fleet was not simply a tool of brute force. It was an instrument of precise, methodical destruction that could dismantle entire armies without hesitation. The psychological impact on the enemy was as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers watched their comrades fall with increasing helplessness, unable to comprehend how a single force could dominate the battlefield so completely. Panic spread faster than any missile, eroding morale and causing disorganized retreats. Commanders shouted orders, but their voices were drowned out by the explosions, the roar of engines, and the sheer chaos that surrounded them. Even well-trained units began to break down, their coordination collapsing under the relentless pressure. Fear became the enemy's constant companion, a shadow that followed every move and paralyzed their decision-making. For the human forces coordinating the fleet, the battle was intense but controlled. Every strike was executed according to plan, every unit operating like a single organism, perfectly synchronized. Ground troops, pilots, and engineers worked in harmony with the fleet above, ensuring that every maneuver contributed to the larger strategy. Even in the face of extreme danger, the discipline and coordination of human forces never wavered. It was as if every soldier and every ship was connected to an invisible network, anticipating the enemy's moves and countering them before they could even act. This level of efficiency transformed the battlefield into a theater of precision warfare, where destruction was deliberate, targeted, and unavoidable. The fleet's relentless nature left the enemy scrambling for cover and shelter. Attempts to fortify positions were quickly rendered useless. Barricades and bunkers, which had been reliable defensive measures in past battles, were destroyed within moments. Roads and bridges were obliterated, isolating units and preventing reinforcements from reaching key points. Even airborne forces found themselves vulnerable, as the fleet's anti-air capabilities intercepted their attempts to intervene. Every move made by the enemy was anticipated and countered, leaving them with few options and no room for error. The human death fleet had transformed the battlefield into a trap, a calculated environment where only the fleet dictated the outcome. Amid the destruction, stories of extraordinary bravery and survival began to circulate. Some human units executed daring maneuvers to rescue trapped comrades, navigating through fire and explosions with uncanny timing. Others managed to disable enemy artillery before it could target human forces, demonstrating the fleet's coordination with ground troops. These acts of courage and skill, though small in the scope of the entire battle, became legendary among soldiers, reinforcing the idea that the human death fleet was not just a weapon, but a force that inspired hope and determination. The fleet's efficiency was complemented by the human element, the courage, skill, and ingenuity of those who operated it, making it a truly unstoppable force. As the battle continued, the battlefield itself seemed to transform under the fleet's influence. Hills, forests, and urban areas were reshaped by the precise and relentless attacks. Entire enemy battalions disappeared within minutes, leaving behind only the wreckage of vehicles, collapsed fortifications, and the echoes of their screams. The terrain became both a weapon and a challenge, with the fleet exploiting every natural and man-made feature to maximize destruction. Even familiar landscapes became dangerous, unpredictable, and deadly. Soldiers had to navigate constantly changing environments while under relentless assault, making every step a test of survival. Despite the devastation, human forces maintained composure. The fleet operated with a disciplined calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos around them. Pilots, artillery teams, and engineers executed complex maneuvers with precision, demonstrating a level of mastery that seemed almost superhuman. Orders were executed instantly, adjustments made on the fly, and attacks coordinated across multiple units to achieve maximum impact. This combination of precision, discipline, and relentless efficiency created an almost unstoppable momentum, leaving the enemy unable to adapt or recover. The psychological effects on both sides were profound. Enemy soldiers faced not only physical destruction, but also an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Their confidence, built over months of training and preparation, crumbled under the fleet's relentless attacks. Panic, confusion, and despair spread quickly, making organized resistance nearly impossible. On the human side, morale soared. Witnessing the fleet's power and precision instilled a renewed sense of hope and determination. Soldiers felt invincible, buoyed by the fleet's presence and the knowledge that they were part of a coordinated, unstoppable force. By the end of the day, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Entire regions were reduced to rubble, supply lines destroyed, and enemy positions annihilated. The human death fleet had not only demonstrated extraordinary firepower, but had also executed a campaign of precision that left nothing to chance. The enemy's ability to fight back had been systematically eliminated, and their morale shattered beyond repair. The fleet's actions were a demonstration of the combination of human discipline, technological power, and strategic mastery, a force capable of reshaping the outcome of the war in a single, relentless campaign. In the aftermath, survivors spoke of the fleet as if it were an unstoppable entity, moving with intelligence and purpose beyond human comprehension. Soldiers described attacks so perfectly timed and executed that it seemed as if the fleet could anticipate their every move. Stories of miraculous escapes, daring rescues, and impossible victories began to spread, creating legends even amid the destruction. The battlefield had become a proving ground, not just for the fleet's power, but for the extraordinary skill and coordination of the humans who operated it. The relentless efficiency of the human death fleet left a lasting impression. The enemy, defeated and demoralized, struggled to understand how a single force could dominate so completely. The survivors carried with them the memory of destruction so precise it seemed almost unnatural, and the knowledge that the war had changed forever. On the human side, the fleet became a symbol of hope, discipline, and the extraordinary potential of coordinated effort. Its actions demonstrated that when power is combined with strategy, courage, and precision, the results can be both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The third day of engagement highlighted something even more profound. The human death fleet was not just a military force. It was a manifestation of strategy, discipline, and determination. It showed that preparation, coordination, and relentless execution could overwhelm even the most prepared enemy. Every strike, every maneuver, and every calculated attack was a testament to human ingenuity and resolve. Soldiers who witnessed the fleet's operations understood that what they were seeing was history in motion, an event that would be remembered and recounted for generations. The battlefield, scarred and transformed, stood as evidence of the fleet's unparalleled efficiency. The enemy had been crushed not merely by brute force but by a combination of speed, precision, and relentless determination. Survivors of the attack carried with them stories of devastation and heroism, while human forces celebrated the mastery and power they had unleashed. The human death fleet had proven that in war, calculated precision and disciplined execution could achieve results far beyond what brute strength alone could accomplish. By the end of this part of the campaign, it was clear that the human death fleet had rewritten the rules of warfare. Its precision, coordination, and relentless attacks had created a battlefield where survival depended not only on skill and courage, but on the ability to adapt to a force that seemed unstoppable. The legend of the fleet grew with every strike, every strategic move, and every successful operation. Soldiers on both sides knew that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a force that combined human skill, discipline, and strategy to achieve results that seemed almost impossible. The human death fleet had already reshaped the battlefield with its precision and relentless attacks, but its most devastating power was not only in its weapons, it was in the fear it created, the uncertainty it spread, and the way it could break the spirit of entire armies without firing a single shot. Enemy soldiers, already shaken by the fleet's sudden arrival and devastating firepower, began to realize that they were facing not just a military force, but an unstoppable presence that seemed to anticipate their every move. Panic spread faster than the explosions across the battlefield, infecting soldiers, officers, and even the commanders who thought themselves prepared for anything. Every decision became heavier, every movement fraught with danger, because the fleet could strike anywhere at any time, with deadly precision. As the fleet moved silently above the war zone, reports of its sudden appearances and vanishings began to circulate among enemy ranks. Soldiers described seeing massive warships appear out of nowhere, unleash destruction, and disappear before they could even identify them properly. These stories, which may have sounded like exaggerations to outsiders, were terrifyingly real to those who experienced them. The uncertainty of not knowing when or where the fleet would strike next created a constant, crushing tension. Commanders attempted to rally their troops, but morale was already crumbling. Every order given was met with hesitation, and every plan was undermined by fear. Soldiers were no longer fighting strategically. They were fighting to survive, moving cautiously, trying to avoid being seen or targeted by the invisible force that had already proven its superiority. The fleet's psychological impact was deliberate, whether intentionally or as a natural consequence of its overwhelming presence. Enemy forces began to experience widespread panic and confusion. Units that were supposed to support each other became isolated, as soldiers abandoned their posts to escape perceived threats. Supply lines were disrupted not just by firepower but by sheer fear. Entire battalions fled in disorganized retreats, leaving their weapons, vehicles, and comrades behind. Fear became a weapon as effective as any missile or laser cannon. The human death fleet had taught the enemy that resistance could be deadly not only physically, but mentally. The thought of facing it again, of surviving another sudden assault, was paralyzing. On the ground, soldiers reported seeing the effects firsthand. In some units, entire squads refused to advance, huddling in trenches or hiding behind debris too terrified to move. Leaders shouted orders, but their voices were drowned out by the chaos and the terror spreading faster than sound. Desertions began to rise as soldiers chose personal survival over duty. Panic spread like a disease, infecting units that were previously disciplined and organized. The fleet's mere presence created an invisible battlefield within the minds of soldiers, where fear dictated action more than any strategy or training. The war was no longer just a contest of strength and tactics. It had become a psychological struggle, where courage could be shattered as easily as a bunker wall. The impact on enemy leadership was severe. Generals and commanders faced mutinies, insubordination, and breakdowns in coordination. The confidence that had carried them through previous battles evaporated in the face of a fleet they could not understand, let alone counter. Even the most experienced strategists struggled to comprehend how an enemy could strike with such precision, speed, and efficiency, leaving almost no opportunity for effective retaliation. They realized that their conventional tactics were useless against a force that could dominate the battlefield in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Fear replaced strategy, and hesitation replaced decisive action. At the same time, human soldiers and units on the battlefield experienced a surge of hope and morale. Witnessing the fleet's dominance inspired them in ways that went beyond relief. The fleet was more than a set of warships. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, discipline, and power. Soldiers who had endured months of dangerous patrols, ambushes, and defensive skirmishes suddenly felt invigorated. The knowledge that the human death fleet was watching over the battlefield, striking with unstoppable precision, gave them the courage to act decisively, to fight harder, and to trust in their own abilities. Where fear reigned among the enemy, confidence spread among humans. The fleet had become not only a weapon of destruction but also a beacon of hope. Even the enemy's most seasoned soldiers and veterans felt the psychological weight of the fleet. Those who had survived countless battles were now vulnerable to terror. Many reported sleepless nights, haunted by memories of the fleet's sudden attacks and the impossibility of predicting its next strike. The fear extended beyond the battlefield, affecting planning, morale, and strategy. Troops hesitated to take positions to reinforce vulnerable areas or to engage in offensive operations because the fear of encountering the fleet again was overwhelming. Every soldier became hyper-aware of the skies, of sudden movements, and of any sign that the fleet might strike. Fear had become an invisible predator, stalking every decision, every step, and every heartbeat. The fleet's ability to inspire both awe and terror was unparalleled. For humans, it was a reminder of what coordinated power, discipline, and courage could achieve. For the enemy, it was a nightmare come to life, a force that could crush them not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. The fleet's reputation grew with every encounter, every sudden strike, and every story told by survivors. Its presence was enough to destabilize armies, disrupt strategies, and force retreats without even engaging in full combat. The legend of the human death fleet had become a psychological weapon just as potent as its cannons and missiles. As the HFY battle continued, the effects of the fleet's presence were amplified. Enemy troops were constantly on edge, reacting to every sound, shadow, and signal with fear and hesitation. Leaders could not organize effective counterattacks because soldiers were too frightened to follow orders. Panic created chaos, and chaos created opportunities for the fleet to strike with even greater precision and effect. On the human side, soldiers took advantage of the enemy's fear. With their morale high and their courage strengthened by the fleet's presence, they executed maneuvers that would have been impossible in earlier battles. The fleet had created a psychological advantage that amplified its physical power, transforming the battlefield into a zone where human forces could dominate without unnecessary losses. Stories of the fleet's psychological impact spread rapidly, becoming part of its legend. Enemy soldiers described it as almost supernatural, appearing suddenly, destroying units without mercy, and then disappearing before a counterattack could be organized. Witnesses told of entire enemy units surrendering or fleeing at the mere hint of the fleet's approach. This created a ripple effect across the war zone as fear spread faster than word of mouth, reaching units that had not even directly encountered the fleet. The human death fleet's influence extended far beyond the range of its weapons. Its presence alone was enough to shape the course of battles, demoralize opponents, and empower allies. Even among the human forces, the psychological effect of the fleet was profound. Soldiers felt invincible knowing that an overwhelming, precise, and disciplined force was operating alongside them. Their courage was not blind. It was supported by the knowledge that every maneuver and attack of the fleet was coordinated with strategy, intelligence, and experience. This psychological boost allowed them to perform feats that would otherwise be impossible under pressure, executing complex operations while maintaining discipline in the midst of chaos. The fleet had become both a shield and a sword, protecting human forces while striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. The aftermath of the fleet's psychological influence was evident across the battlefield. Enemy forces were fractured, demoralized, and increasingly unable to resist coordinated human operations. Desertions, retreats, and surrenders became common. Commanders found themselves powerless against a combination of fear, confusion, and human precision. The fleet had not only defeated armies, it had broken their will to fight. In contrast, human soldiers moved with confidence, making decisions quickly, attacking with precision, and exploiting every weakness in the enemy's morale. The psychological victory was as decisive as the physical one, demonstrating that in war, control over the mind could be as important as control over the battlefield. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the human death fleet's greatest strength was not just firepower, but the fear and awe it inspired. It could strike anywhere, dominate any battlefield, and destroy morale faster than any weapon. Enemy soldiers faced not only physical destruction, but also the mental toll of facing an unstoppable force. Meanwhile, human forces grew stronger, braver, and more effective with every strike, knowing that the fleet's presence ensured their dominance. The psychological warfare had turned the tide of the conflict, proving that terror and hope, when wielded by a disciplined and precise force, could determine the outcome of battles before a single bullet hit its target. The human death fleet had become more than a fleet of ships. It had become a living symbol of fear and hope, of destruction and protection, of chaos and discipline. Its power to shape the minds of soldiers, to disrupt strategies, and to inspire courage had transformed the war zone into a battlefield dominated not only by firepower, but also by the human mind. Enemy forces would never forget it, and human soldiers would always carry the knowledge that with courage, discipline, and coordination they were unstoppable. When the battle finally ended, the war zone was unrecognizable. Smoke hung thick in the air, the ground was scarred with craters, and the ruins of buildings, vehicles, and fortifications told the story of the human death fleet's unstoppable assault. Entire enemy battalions had been destroyed or scattered, and what remained was a battlefield marked not just by physical devastation, but by the psychological impact of facing a force so precise, so relentless, that it seemed unstoppable. Survivors of the enemy forces whispered stories of sudden strikes, impossible escapes, and the terrifying presence of massive warships that appeared out of nowhere, struck with deadly accuracy, and disappeared before anyone could respond. These stories spread fear far beyond the immediate battlefield, turning what had been a conventional war into a campaign defined by the legend of a single unstoppable fleet. For human soldiers, the aftermath was a mixture of exhaustion, awe, and pride. They had witnessed firsthand the sheer power of the fleet, and they understood that their victory had been more than a simple military success. It was a demonstration of human ingenuity, discipline, and coordination. Every soldier, pilot, and commander had played a role in a battle that would be remembered for generations. A battle in which the fleet had not only crushed the enemy, but had also reshaped the course of the war entirely. Even in the midst of fatigue, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Men and women who had fought for months in uncertainty now knew that the tide had turned decisively in their favor. The enemy, on the other hand, was left in disarray. Units were scattered, leaders demoralized, and the remaining forces uncertain of how to regroup. Desertions increased, and communication lines were still disrupted. Those who survived the human death fleet's assault carried with them a mix of terror and disbelief. They could not comprehend how such a force could operate with such coordination and precision, striking targets that seemed unreachable and anticipating every move. Their defeat was not just a loss of territory or resources, it was a collapse of morale and confidence, an acknowledgement that they had faced something far beyond anything they had ever imagined. The psychological impact lingered long after the physical battle ended. Stories of bravery and heroism emerged amidst the destruction. Soldiers recounted near-impossible rescues, daring maneuvers, and feats of skill that had turned certain death into survival. These stories became part of the legend of the human death fleet, inspiring both awe and respect. Even as the enemy tried to understand what had happened, human forces celebrated the extraordinary achievement of their coordinated efforts. The fleet had operated with precision and efficiency, but it had also allowed individuals on the ground and in the air to demonstrate courage, creativity, and determination. Every successful maneuver and every act of bravery added to the growing legend of the fleet. transforming it into something more than machines and weapons. It had become a symbol of human resolve. The terrain of the battlefield had changed dramatically. Hills and forests were scarred, rivers were polluted with debris, and entire cities had been reduced to rubble. The physical devastation served as a reminder of the fleet's overwhelming power, and the enemy forces who survived could not ignore the scale of destruction. Strategic points had been annihilated, making further resistance difficult if not impossible. The fleet's ability to strike with precision meant that the most critical enemy positions were neutralized efficiently, leaving few opportunities for counterattacks. The Warzone itself had become a testament to the effectiveness and power of coordinated human effort. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the legend of the human death fleet began to grow. Soldiers who had witnessed its power shared their experiences, and civilians who had observed the battle from afar heard tales of ships that struck like lightning, appearing suddenly and destroying everything in their path. The fleet's reputation spread across nations and front lines, turning fear into a tool that reshaped enemy behavior even before the next engagement. Enemy commanders had to account for the fleet in their planning, knowing that its appearance could negate months of preparation in an instant. The fleet had transcended its physical form to become a symbol of unstoppable force, reshaping the strategic landscape of the entire war. The fleet's influence extended beyond fear and legend. It became a symbol of hope and determination for human forces. Soldiers who had endured countless skirmishes and hardships now carried with them the knowledge that they had the support of an overwhelming, precise, and disciplined force. Confidence surged, and morale soared as humans realized that no matter the size or strength of the enemy, they could rely on the fleet to tip the scales decisively. This psychological advantage was invaluable. It allowed soldiers to act boldly, make quick decisions, and coordinate more effectively, knowing that the fleet was watching over them, striking with unmatched precision when needed. Over time, the human death fleet became a part of history, not just as a weapon, but as a legend. Stories of its sudden arrivals, impossible strikes, and relentless efficiency were passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing tales of warships that could destroy entire armies in minutes, of soldiers saved against impossible odds, and of battles decided before they had fully begun. The fleet became a symbol of human ingenuity, courage, and the ability to achieve the impossible. Its legacy was not only measured in victories and destroyed enemy units, but in the hope and inspiration it instilled in those who fought alongside it and the fear it left in those who faced it. The battlefield itself became a place of reflection. Survivors walked among the ruins, remembering the chaos and destruction, but also the courage and discipline that had prevailed. Human soldiers took stock of their experiences, understanding that they had been part of something extraordinary. The enemy, though defeated, carried with them the memory of the fleet's precision and power, lessons in humility, fear, and respect. The war had changed, shaped irrevocably by the presence of a fleet that had struck without warning, crushed the enemy, and then vanished like a force of legend. The fleet's actions had long-term effects on military strategy and planning. Commanders across the human forces began to understand the importance of coordination, precision, and disciplined execution. Training programs were adapted to reflect the lessons learned, emphasizing not only strength and firepower, but also efficiency, strategy, and the psychological impact of overwhelming presence. The enemy, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild and rethink its approach, knowing that conventional tactics were insufficient against a force that could dominate both physically and psychologically. The arrival and success of the human death fleet had changed the very nature of warfare, demonstrating that victory depended not just on numbers or weapons, but on intelligence, timing, and the ability to inspire fear and hope simultaneously. The aftermath also highlighted the resilience of human forces. Despite the immense destruction, soldiers remained committed, disciplined, and capable of continuing the fight. They had witnessed a power that could decimate enemies in moments, yet they had also seen the value of coordination, courage, and strategic thinking. The human death fleet had shown that when humans combined ingenuity with disciplined execution, there was almost no limit to what could be achieved. The fleet's presence, once a rumor or legend, had become a living proof of human potential, a testament to what could be accomplished when individuals acted in perfect unity toward a single goal. Even months after the battle, the psychological impact persisted. Enemy forces operated with a constant awareness of the fleet's potential return. Morale remained fragile, and hesitation often replaced decisive action. On the human side, soldiers carried confidence and pride, knowing they had survived and thrived under the protection and coordination of an unstoppable force. The legend of the fleet grew with every retelling, inspiring awe and respect, and ensuring that its impact extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The human death fleet had accomplished more than destruction. It had reshaped history. It had demonstrated the devastating power of precision, coordination, and discipline. It had shown that fear and hope could be wielded as weapons as effectively as any missile or cannon. Entire armies had been defeated not just by firepower, but by the psychological impact of facing a force that seemed unstoppable. The fleet's actions had created a legend, a story that would be passed down for generations, and a standard of excellence that human forces would strive to emulate. In the final analysis, the human death fleet had left an indelible mark on the war. It had crushed the enemy without warning, leaving a battlefield scarred by both physical destruction and the memory of fear. It had inspired human forces, teaching lessons in courage, strategy, and coordination. And it had become a legend, a symbol of human potential and the extraordinary power of an unstoppable, precise, and disciplined force. The war would never be the same again, for both the humans and their enemies had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would be remembered as a turning point in history. The day the human death fleet entered the war zone and left a legacy of awe, fear, and triumph.